Alejandro Catterberg, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for having me.
Alejandro Catterberg is the founder of Poliarquía, Argentina's best known and most respected consultancy and polling firm. Joins us today to talk about the surprising, or perhaps not so surprising, increasing popularity for Alberto Fernández, the new president of Argentina. Alberto Fernández, of course, was elected in a very close election last October. He won with less than 50% of the vote. I believe it was 49%. And yet, in the most recent polls from Poliarquía, we've seen his popularity increase to as high as 80%. Now, this is not only occurring in Argentina. We've seen elsewhere in Latin America and elsewhere in the world skyrocketing public approval ratings for presidents during the COVID-19 pandemic. And yet, everything we had heard and understood about Argentina leading up to this crisis led us to believe that opinions were pretty strongly held and maybe not so malleable even in a crisis, given this so-called grieta, this famous division in Argentine politics and society that we'd seen over many years during the three governments of the Kirchner family and during the last government of the center-right administration of Mauricio Macri. Alejandro, were you surprised to see the change in public approval for Alberto Fernández?
A little bit, Ben. As you said, basically what happened is we have seen a dramatic change since the beginning of the coronavirus crisis. Prior to that, basically in the first 3 months of his presidency, Alberto Fernández has a, very good number of approval, around 65, 66%. A little bit below what Macri had or even Cristina Kirchner had during the first few months of their administration. So the numbers were on average until we saw that skyrocketing number going up at the beginning of the crisis, of the coronavirus crisis. And I think it's a little bit of what you said. The crisis around the globe is helping the presidents gathering support of their people. It has to be with the idea of being attacked from something that we don't know yet what is happening and from where it's coming and how much damage could inflict in the society. But also has to do, and going back with your point of La Grieta, it also has to do with the fact that Fernández has been trying to represent during the campaign and in the beginning of his administration the idea that he's not far on the one side of the grieta. He's trying to play the middle ground. And he has been quite successful in doing that. And while his numbers are going up, that is not happening with Cristina Kirchner numbers. Cristina Kirchner numbers remain more or less the same, or even a little bit lower. So nowadays, Alberto Fernández has more than 35% of people who is supporting him, but that do not support Cristina Kirchner. And one more thing, this is not only happening with Alberto Fernández. This is happening with almost most of the politicians in Argentina who are in charge of dealing with the crisis. It's happening with governors, it's happening with mayors, and it's happening with the chief of the opposition right now, Horacio Rodríguez Larreta, who is the mayor of Buenos Aires City and a close ally of Mauricio Macri. Horacio Rodríguez Larreta now has become the second most popular or supported politician in Argentina. And the interesting thing about this is that the two politicians with the higher support right now in Argentina are the ones who are leading the moderate side of the coalitions. Because in both sides of the coalitions, in the Peronismo and Kirchnerismo and in the Cambiemos coalition, we have moderate politicians and we have the extremist ones. And the interesting thing is that what we are seeing right now is that the vast majority of Argentina society is supporting the moderate ones. During this time, Mauricio Macri popularity has been going down. And as what is happening between Alberto Fernández and Cristina Kirchner is also happening between Larreta and Macri. Now Larreta has like 35 or more percentage of support than what Mauricio Macri has. So that is one of the interesting things that is happening with the coronavirus crisis. Is at somehow it's putting a stop or a pause in the Grieta conflict that we have seen over and over the years here.
So it sounds like the phenomenon, maybe in part the rally around the flag during a time of crisis, and part it may be actual recognition of performance. If it is that both the mayor of Buenos Aires, who's from the opposition party, the president of Argentina, both in office and both addressing the coronavirus crisis with policies that have been largely embraced by the Argentine public. But that has also been rather surprising to outsiders. I mean, there's been a lot of positive reflections on the public health approach in Argentina, which has involved a very strict national quarantine, started March 20th, recently extended again. The expectations were that people would grow weary of this policy, particularly given the economic vulnerability of Argentina going into this crisis, right? This was entering your third year in recession. You had poverty and unemployment increasing before the pandemic. You were entering into a debt crisis. And in fact, we can discuss this in a bit. You've recently defaulted on your sovereign debt again. There was a sense that Argentina, with such a high level of informal workers, such economic vulnerability, again, all of this before the pandemic, would not put up with such strict stay-at-home measures for long. And in fact, we might even see social unrest. It's been the opposite. It seems like these measures have been a driver of approval for President Alberto Fernández. Why? And for how long?
Well, you're right on the point. Basically, our surveys in Poliarquía are showing on average over the last almost now 10 weeks that there is something close to 80% support for the quarantine and for the measures that Fernández and the other governors, Larreta, Kicillof, are taking. A lot of this has to do with fear. When you see the international poolings, the comparison of the international poolings that my colleagues are doing around the globe, and we share it through Weibo, you can see that Argentina society is showing one of the highest level of fear against the coronavirus. And that has to do probably with the media, how they presented it. That probably has to do with how the government presented, or it has to be something within Argentina society that we haven't figured out yet. But even though we haven't seen an important increase of number of cases in Argentina of coronavirus and an important number of deaths, still Argentina society shows one of the highest level of worriness and fear against the pandemic. So I think that is one of the important things that gives support for the quarantine and for the Fernández government decisions. Going back to your economic question, I think that at some point, the economic structure of Argentina has helped in this point, because you mentioned the informality, but what we have to see and understand about Argentina, and this is something that has a deep root in the years of Cristina Kirchner, is the level of expansion. We have 3.5 million public employees that every month receive their salaries, no matter what happened. We have 7.5 million pensions that elder people receive, no matter what happened. We have millions of social subsidies that people receive, no matter what happened. So basically, there is a lot of people, a lot of millions of people in their house, still receiving the same salary and basically not working or working from home. So they have not yet realized the kind of economic impact that this is going to have. Basically, what we are seeing in our surveys is that there is a fraction of Argentinian people who is being severely affected. And that people is, of course, as is happening around the globe, people who basically depends on the daily work for their salaries or for how they get their money. And that could be an upper middle class lawyer, or that could be a lower income, a gardener, or whatever. So those people are complaining, and those people tend to not to support the quarantine in order to ask for the reopening of the economy. But when you still see the surveys, even though that in the last few weeks this has started to little by little losing support, still the vast majority of the society support the quarantine, and still there are many millions of people who are not being affected economically by this crisis. And on top of that, Ben, you have to add the fact that the government has sent 7.5 million checks for the people who has asked for that money.
So, I mean, some of it seems like is, a delay maybe in the economic impacts as felt by Argentines. Some of it is, a recognition of the gravity of the public health threat. You've seen, as you've described in your poll, great deal of anxiety about the coronavirus. The question of how long the president can sustain his popularity given these conditions, I think, still remains. And maybe we'll conclude with this. It strikes me that even with all the social supports that you've been describing, all of the pensions, the social service programs, the country's economy is likely to, contract by 5, 6, 7% this year. That inevitably is going to lead to another rise in unemployment, a big increase in poverty. And again, we have to put it in the context now. This will be the third straight year of recession. This is a government that came into office with the expectation of increasing, again, the size of the state, increasing prosperity, at least for its constituencies. On the other side of this pandemic, of the two trends that we've discussed, both are either sustainable. And those trends are this rally around the president, a more moderate politics in Argentina, perhaps, dare I say, an end to the grieta, and the support particularly for a president at these stratospheric levels of near 80%, when he'll be governing with few resources and over a population that really will see its expectations probably dashed in short order.
Well, Ben, my personal opinion or analysis is that I'm not very optimistic about the possibility that this kind of support that we are seeing right now from the society to Alberto Fernández, but to many of the most important leaders in Argentina, the moderate leaders, will be able to continue. The pandemic will go away someday, in 1 month, 2 months, 6 months from now, but it will go. But the economic crisis will stay. And as you said, we are heading to the third consecutive year of recession and also high inflation, more than 50% probably. So probably what we will see in the following month is more poverty, more inflation, more unemployment, and that will create that many of the people who are right now supporting Fernández will probably vanish away. And in my opinion, this is the key thing here. When Alberto Fernández started his government, I think there was basically two paths for him to follow. And that the political path that he was going to choose was going to determine the economic output of Argentina. So if he decided to moderate himself in terms of politics, we could reach some kind of economic stability. But if he was going to radicalize himself and lay on more on Cristina Kirchner and the Kirchnerista side, we were heading to a deep economic crisis. So I think it was very clear in the first 3 months of Alberto Fernández's government that he has chose the moderate path. He decided to travel to Europe, meet with the European presidents to get support to deal with the IMF. He started dealing and negotiating with the IMF. He opened a negotiation with the bondholders in order to restructure Argentina debt. He passed a law in an agreement with the opposition to basically cut and reduce pensions, something that was considered almost impossible for a Kirchnerista government to do that, and he did it. So, and he was as moderate as you can be when you are partnered with Cristina Kirchner. So I think he has chose the path of political moderation in order to get economic stability. The problem is that coronavirus happened, and that now the economic stability is probably not possible to reach. So now we are going to see an economic crisis coming. So politics is not going to determine the economic output, because the economic output is going to be determined by the level of recession and that we are going to suffer because of this crisis. So the big question I have for myself is that if it's possible in Argentina to have an economic crisis that can live with political moderation in the head of the government. And I tend to believe that that is very difficult to happen. I tend to believe that as soon as we get into the crisis, as soon as prices will go up again, as soon as unemployment will arise again, as soon as we see the kind of consequences that we're going to see for what is happening in Argentina, but also what is happening in Brazil and what is happening in the world, I think that we're going to see that this moderation and this kind of good time in politics that we are seeing vanish away. And we're going to see probably a new round of radicalization, and we're going to see that probably Alberto Fernández will have to get closer to the more radical sector of his alliance or his coalition in the hands of Cristina Kirchner, a member, and many of the Kirchneristas, and probably the harder Macristas or the harder lines of Cambiemos in the line of Mauricio Macri himself or Patricia Bullrich or people who have been very tough on the Peronist government will reemerge, and probably we are heading back to a new round of La Grieta in the middle of an economic crisis. So that I think is the biggest risk that we are facing. But for me, I don't know if we are going to be able to avoid that situation.
And how does the default play into the scenario that you just described? I know I promised that was the last question, but I have to ask. I mean, there's a perception outside Argentina that default is always good politics, that it's Argentina against the world, that it's Argentina against evil Wall Street, or that at least with the strong Peronist base, it's always good politics, regardless of the economic consequences, to fight against Wall Street. I don't think Poliarquía's polling supports that view. What's your sense of what Argentines want out of this debt crisis resolution?
I think that is a misconception. That represents the opinion of a minority of Argentina society, and politicians in the past have used it in a way to create some round of populism and support for the decisions. But we have made a survey recently, and basically it shows that the kind of ideological opinion about that, the best thing to do is not to pay anything, and because that's the thing that is good for the country and whatever, it only is supported by less than 20% of Argentinian people. And that is the hard group of supporters that the Kirchner always had. Remember that we talked in the past that the support for the Kirchner, the hardliners of the Kirchner, were always between 20 to 25% of the people. So you have 20% of the people, or even a little bit less of that, of Argentinians saying, we don't have to pay anything. We have to isolate ourselves from the world and do nothing to do with anyone. But then you have like 60% of Argentinian people saying, no, that is not the best way to do. And of course, you have 1 in 4 Argentinians saying, I don't know enough about this subject to bring an opinion. So I think that the fact of Argentina trying to avoid a new default, or we are already in default, but getting to end the negotiation and getting out from there as fast as possible, I think at least open a door for trying to go back in the near future to some kind of economic stability and some political moderation. Without the agreement, I think we have to have even less hope to see in a few months or years from now the return of some kind of political moderation and economic stability. So I think it's quite important, not for what is going to happen in the next 6 months or in the next year, but I think it's quite important for having an option in the near future of Argentina. Because if we are heading to a new default again, and that will limit the credit that the private companies will be able to get in the next few years when the international crisis, economic crisis goes by, then the potential for Argentina to recover will be very limited. I think so. If Alberto Fernández is betting or still betting on some political moderation and trying to put back Argentina economy in some moderate track, I think he needs to settle this disagreement.
Alejandro Catterberg, founder of Poliarquía, our partner in the Argentina Pulse survey that the Wilson Center's Latin American program conducts in Argentina. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys for the invitation, and we can repeat it whenever you want.